All right, we're just going to go over a short lesson overview here. We're going to talk about the history of English spelling, why spelling matters, and we're going to end with some ways to improve your spelling. All right, the history of spelling. Obviously, spelling is the art of putting the letters in the correct order to say the word you're trying to say. But believe it or not, spelling was not always standardized. English uses the Roman phonetic alphabet. Yeah, the guys in the armor and the skirts, those guys, their alphabet. We use their alphabet. And unfortunately, this alphabet was designed for representing Latin, their language, not English, our language, sounds. And so you get some kind of weird things going on. That's why spelling has varied so widely throughout the history of the English language. English spelling is an attempt to use somebody else's tools to speak our language, and things get weird. Writers in Anglo-Saxon, which was a Germanic language that was one of the ancestors of English, they just kind of sounded out the words they were trying to say. So unfortunately, that means that writers with different accents and different guesses as to how to spell things spelled words differently. You would find spelling varied widely from one part of England to another, just because people in one place said ah, where people in another place said and they spelled it differently. And there's actually an entire discipline of trying to figure out what they were spelling. It's completely insane. After the Norman conquest in 1066, the French-speaking royal court under William the Conqueror began setting the standard for spelling, including things like the letter C making a S sound rather than the K sound that it had made in Latin. So, for example, in Latin the word for city was civitas, except they didn't spell it with a K, they used the letter C. So they spelled it, what we would now read as civitas, but they pronounced it civitas. So, civitas then became civitas because that's how you say it in French, which led to our English word city. The Romans would be absolutely horrified if they saw us looking at the letter C and going S. But that's the Normans for you. Now, after the advent of movable type printing in the 1400s, remember Johann Gutenberg, there was an explosion of documentation, and schools and other institutions began teaching many and many more people how to read and write. So at this point, you have people all over the country suddenly learning how to read and write. It's a big industry, and they can't communicate with each other if they don't have a standard system of spelling. So at least in English, London English became the basis of standard spelling because that's where all the printers were. Go figure. In the 1500s, something called the Great English Vowel Shift changed the way English speakers pronounce their vowels and led, among other things, to the creation of the silent E and other silent letters. So, for example, if we look at the word write up above, before the Great English Vowel Shift, that might have been pronounced something more like rita or writa. You would say that E. But thanks to the vowel shift, we stopped saying that unaccented at the end of the sentence, or end of the word rather, and it became a silent E and we got the word write. So, just so you know, Middle English speakers listening to us would be completely confused. After England became Protestant rather than Catholic in the late 1500s, the Bible was translated into English, the King James Version of 1611. This is the translation of the Bible that is most quoted, most studied. It was a very, very, very popular translation, being the first legal translation into English, and it had a big impact on spelling because for hundreds and hundreds of years, if anybody had any book in their home, it was likely to be the King James Bible. So a lot of words just ended up being spelled the way they were in 1611 because that's how they spell it in the Bible, and therefore that's how it must be spelled. I told you English was crazy. All right, with all this new literacy, with everybody having a Bible in the home and people learning to read and write left and right, writers had a problem. Non-standard spelling slows down silent reading. Now, we got to rewind a little bit here because up until about the Middle Ages, most people who read anything read aloud. You were taught to read aloud. There's actually a story of Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian, coming upon his teacher, Albert the Great, reading a scroll or a book or something like that, and he's reading it silently, and Thomas Aquinas just stares at him because he's never seen anybody read without talking before. It was totally unknown in that period, or almost totally unknown. But by the time the Renaissance comes along, and the 1500s and the 1600s, silent reading becomes more and more of a thing, and then you have the problem that while all those silent letters don't slow you down much when you're talking, because you can only talk so fast, when you're reading silently, you go much faster, but non-standard spelling, having to stop and go, what does that word mean? It really slows you down and it makes your writing less clear. But of course, no one agreed on how to spell things. So along come the 1700s and the rise of dictionaries. These started as basically very smart people going, "This is how you spell words because I say so." These were essentially cheat sheets for hard-to-spell words, especially those borrowed from classical languages like Greek and Latin, or the languages of the New World colonies. Remember, this is the point where England and France and Spain and all these other countries were setting up colonies in the New World, and they were borrowing Indian words for things like tobacco. And at that point, you had a lot of trouble spelling them because who knows how to spell an Iroquois? The earliest well-known English dictionary was written by Samuel Johnson, who's still very well known, and most of the spellings in Johnson's dictionary are still used today, at least in England. After the United States won independence in the late 1700s, Americans wanted to distance themselves from Britain. Ha! We're different. We have our own, better kind of English. And so Noah Webster created a standard dictionary of American spelling. So if you ever want to check how something's spelled in American English, Webster's dictionary, or the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is pretty much the way to go. And this, by the way, is why you will have so many extra letters in British spellings that you don't find in American spellings. All right, since Noah Webster, spelling reform movements, attempts to get rid of silent letters and things like that, they've come and gone largely without effect, mostly because everybody went, "But the dictionary says spell it that way." British spellings were once the international standard, but the growing influence of the United States in the 20th century led many English speakers to adopt the American variations instead. Thus, today's spelling geeks should argue over whether color should be spelled with a U. So it used to be if you wanted to, be a good professional writer and work in the international field, you had to spell color C-O-L-O-U-R. Now, if you want to be a good writer and work in the international field, or, God forbid, on the internet, you have to spell it C-O-L-O-R. And spelling geeks on both sides of the Atlantic continue to throw stones at each other. Spelling seems to be holding pretty steady for now, if only because changing English spelling at this point means our kids won't be able to read our old documents anymore. But the language itself continues to change all the time. So you can't expect spelling to stay constant forever, or even for your own lifetime. I'm warning you now, watch out for the rise of internet spelling. Because the way spelling usually changes is somebody goes, "Everybody already spells it this way anyway, let's just change the official spelling." Then you go look at the internet and you fear for the future of the English language. All right, so why does spelling matter? Why have I just given you this mini lecture on the history of spelling and why it's so important? Well, spelling is a regional and cultural identifier, which means how you spell words tells people where you learn to read and write. That communicates a lot of information to them, and if you know what information you're communicating, you can control it. Second, good spelling is considered a mark of good education. If you want to impress people with how well educated you are and how smart you are, you want to be a good speller. This is mostly because, while people don't notice good spelling so much, they really notice bad spelling. Bad spelling slows down your reader's eye. Remember I was talking about after the King James Bible came along, people figured out that invent your own spelling, spelling is optional, really gives people fits. Bad spelling slows down the eye, which makes your writing more difficult to understand. It takes your reader's attention off what you're saying and emphasizes how you're saying it. 99 times out of 100, that's not what you want to be doing with your writing. Finally, bad spelling is considered unprofessional, and it can make a bad impression in school, in the business world, and in everyday life. Frankly, it just makes you look stupid. So, here are some ways that you can improve your spelling. The first and most important is read. Read whatever you like. Read whatever's interesting. You don't have to go read boring books or go read the dictionary. Find a book that looks interesting to you, find magazine articles that look interesting to you, and just read them. The more experience you have with correctly spelled words, the more likely it is that a misspelled word will just look wrong to you and you'll fix it. Best thing you can do for your spelling is read. If you can't be bothered to read, or if you want to do something else, try playing word games like Scrabble and Words with Friends. You can do word puzzles like crosswords and jumbles. They make you think a lot more about spelling and the order that letters go in, and they generally improve your spelling skills. You can also use mnemonics to help you remember tricky spelling rules. For example, the normal I before E except after C rule, well, there are some exceptions to that, and one of them is the word weird. Normally that E sound in English would be spelled I-E, but in weird, it's spelled E-I. So the way I always remember that is weird is spelled weirdly. Now I don't misspell weird anymore. Another way to improve your spelling is when you write with a word processing program, keep spell check turned on. Watch for those little red lines to show up under your misspelled words. And keep a real dictionary handy because spell check is incredibly stupid. I've always thought of spell check as a wonderful opportunity to spend hours teaching computers to spell. So it's not perfect, but it will help you, especially if you have problems with basic spelling. And finally, did I mention read? Read is the single best thing you can do to make yourself a better speller. No, I'm not kidding. Actually, read. And that's all for this lesson. Thank you for watching. Educator.com.